Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. For a bit of fun, comment where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The telegram arrived on a morning draped in a familiar London grey. Its stark message conveyed the grim necessity of my presence in Whitechapel. A new terror had taken root in the district, its tendrils mimicking the horrors of a bygone era. The details, though brief, painted a gruesome tableau, echoing the spectral crimes that had once haunted these very streets. The cab journey east offered no respite from the disquiet that had settled within me. The city seemed to hold its breath, the usual cacophony muted as if acknowledging the darkness that had resurfaced. Upon arrival, the scene was a grim testament to the telegram's stark pronouncements. The air possessed a certain stillness, a vacuum where life and vitality ought to have been. The constables present wore expressions of grim resignation, their faces etched with the unsettling familiarity of unimaginable violence. I surveyed the location, my gaze sweeping across the cobblestones slick with moisture. The gas lamps cast feeble circles of light, doing little to penetrate the gloom that clung to the narrow alleyway. There was a distinct chill in the atmosphere, a coldness that seemed to emanate not from the weather, but from something far more profound and disturbing. The very stones beneath my feet seemed to exude a sense of violation, a silent scream trapped within their aged surfaces. My examination commenced. Each minute detail, each minute aberration was noted and catalogued within the intricate workings of my mind. The precision of the acts, the almost ritualistic nature of the mutilations, bore an undeniable resemblance to the phantom of years past. Yet there was something different, an almost intangible quality that set these new atrocities apart. It was a subtle shift, a variation on a theme of terror that hinted at something more than mere imitation. As days bled into nights, my investigation continued. I traversed the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel, each footfall echoing in the oppressive stillness. The fog, a perpetual shroud in this part of the city, seemed to possess a sentience of its own, swirling and coalescing into amorphous shapes that danced at the periphery of my vision. There were moments, standing in the deserted thoroughfares, when I experienced a distinct sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck as if unseen eyes were fixed upon me. The feeling intensified with each passing hour, each new discovery. It was not a tangible presence, not something that could be seen or touched, but rather a pervasive awareness of being observed. The sensation was akin to walking through a room filled with silent watchers, their gazes following my every move. The fog seemed to whisper secrets, unintelligible murmurs that brushed against my ears, carrying with them a chilling undertone. I pursued every lead, every whisper of information that surfaced from the shadows of this afflicted district. I interviewed those who had brushed against the edges of these terrible events, their words painting fragmented pictures of fear and desperation. Yet through it all, the feeling persisted, the constant awareness of an unseen entity lurking just beyond the veil of perception. There were nights when sleep eluded me entirely. I would sit in my lodgings, the gaslight casting long dancing figures on the walls, and contemplate the enigma that had gripped Whitechapel. The murders themselves were horrific, but it was this persistent sense of being stalked, this feeling of an invisible presence, that truly unsettled me. It was a sensation that defied logic, that hinted at forces beyond the realm of conventional understanding. I revisited the scenes of the crimes, seeking some overlooked detail, some subtle clue that might illuminate the darkness. The silence of these places was profound, broken only by the occasional mournful cry of a distant train. Yet within that silence I could almost sense a lingering echo of the terror that had unfolded there. A psychic residue that clung to the very air. The pattern of the killings continued, each new victim adding another layer to the macabre tapestry. The city held its breath, gripped by a fear that threatened to consume it entirely. The newspapers screamed their headlines, fueling the public anxiety, but offering no real insight into the source of this renewed horror. My own apprehension grew with each passing day. The feeling of being watched was no longer a fleeting sensation. It had become a constant companion, a shadow that followed me through the fog-choked streets. There were moments when I would spin around suddenly, convinced that I would finally confront my unseen stalker. But there was never anything there, only the swirling fog and the oppressive silence. One evening, while traversing a particularly desolate alleyway, the sensation intensified dramatically. It was as if the unseen presence had drawn impossibly near. The very air seemed to vibrate with an almost palpable energy. I could feel a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, a chilling emanation that seemed to seep into my very bones. I paused, my senses on high alert, straining to detect any sign of my unseen pursuer. The fog swirled around me, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. There was a faint scent in the air, something metallic and faintly sweet, that sent a shiver down my spine. Then, from the swirling mist ahead, a shape began to coalesce. It was indistinct at first, a dark form emerging from the grey. As it solidified, I could discern a figure, its outline vaguely human, yet somehow different. It stood motionless, its form partially obscured by the fog, but its presence was undeniable. A profound sense of dread washed over me, colder and more absolute than anything I had ever experienced. The figure remained silent, unmoving, yet its very stillness radiated an aura of unimaginable menace. I could feel its gaze upon me, an intense, unseen focus that pierced through the fog and into my very soul. Then, with a suddenness that made my blood run cold, the figure began to advance. Its steps were soundless on the damp cobblestones, yet I could feel the approach, a subtle shift in the very fabric of the night. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, more cloying, and the chilling emanation intensified, enveloping me in a wave of icy dread. The form continued its advance, emerging further from the fog, and I could now perceive more of its features. The gaslight flickered nearby, its feeble illumination catching a glint of something sharp and metallic in the figure's hand. The shape continued its inexorable approach, and the last thing I registered was the feeling of an icy breath upon my face. The summons to Highgate Cemetery arrived with a certain gravity. The nature of the disturbance was unusual, even for the annals of peculiar London occurrences. Several graves had been unearthed, not with the crude haste of robbery, but with a methodical precision that hinted at a more singular purpose. The cemetery, even in daylight, possessed an atmosphere of solemnity. Towering monuments and elaborate mausoleums stood sentinel over the slumbering inhabitants. The air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a constant reminder of mortality. The disturbed graves were clustered together in an older section, their freshly turned soil stark against the weathered stone of their neighbours. My examination commenced with a careful survey of the affected plots. The earth had been moved with a singular focus, the excavations reaching a certain depth and then abruptly ceasing. There were no signs of removed valuables, no scattered bones indicative of grave robbing. This was something else entirely. As I scrutinized the disturbed earth, certain patterns began to emerge. The soil around the openings appeared compressed, as if something had exerted pressure from below. There were also faint striations in the loose earth, almost like drag marks leading away from the disturbed sites. These marks were subtle, easily missed by a casual observer, but to a trained eye they spoke of a consistent direction of egress. The layout of the disturbed graves also presented a curious anomaly. They formed a loose, almost staggered line, as if something was moving in a particular direction beneath the surface. This suggested a purpose beyond mere random desecration. My initial hypothesis began to solidify. Something was indeed emerging from these graves. The question then became what and why. The thought sent a shiver not of fear, but of intellectual intrigue mixed with a growing sense of the macabre. I spent the remainder of the day meticulously documenting the disturbed sites, noting every minute detail, every subtle impression in the soil. As dusk began to settle over the cemetery, casting long, distorted shapes from the tombstones, I made arrangements for an undisturbed vigil. The darkness held the key to this enigma. I secreted myself within the shadows of a large mausoleum, my gaze fixed upon the disturbed graves. The cemetery at night possessed an entirely different character. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, painted the landscape in shades of grey and black, enhancing the already eerie atmosphere. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, and a damp chill permeated the air. The shadows seemed to deepen and writhe, playing tricks on the eye. Then, just as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky a pale grey, I perceived it, a subtle disturbance in the soil of one of the affected graves. It was almost imperceptible, a slight shifting of the loose earth. I held my breath, my senses on high alert. The movement continued, a slow, almost imperceptible parting of the soil. Then a shape began to emerge. It was dark, indistinct in the pre-dawn gloom, but undeniably present. It rose slowly from the earth, its form gradually taking shape. I remained hidden within the mausoleum, my gaze fixed upon the unfolding spectacle. The emerging form was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Its silhouette was vaguely humanoid, yet elongated and distorted in a manner that defied natural proportions. Its limbs appeared thin and spindly, its head an amorphous mass that seemed to absorb the faint light. It moved with a jerky, uneven gait, as if unaccustomed to the surface world. It paused at the edge of the grave, its indistinct head swivelling as if attempting to orient itself in the dim light. Then it began to move away from the disturbed plot, its form disappearing into the labyrinth of tombstones. I remained concealed until the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds. The grave from which the figure had emerged was now slightly more disturbed, the opening wider. The drag marks in the surrounding soil were more pronounced, leading away into the depths of the cemetery. The following nights brought similar observations. Different graves, different emerging forms, each as unsettling and inexplicable as the last. They appeared to follow no discernible pattern in their emergence, yet their direction of travel, away from the disturbed plots, seemed consistent. My investigation continued, focusing on the areas where the emerging figures disappeared into the darkness. I discovered faint trails leading away from the cemetery grounds, trails that vanished into the surrounding urban landscape. Where were they going? What was their purpose? The disturbed graves remained a chilling testament to their nocturnal activities. The local authorities were baffled, attributing the desecration to vandals or some obscure cult. They dismissed my theories as flights of fancy, but I knew what I had witnessed. Something was stirring beneath the soil of Highgate Cemetery. Something was emerging from the earth under the cover of darkness. The implications were profound, disturbing. One night I decided to follow one of the emerging figures. Concealed in the shadows, I tracked its uneven progress through the maze of tombstones, out of the cemetery grounds and into the silent streets of London. The figure moved with an unsettling purpose, its elongated form occasionally glimpsed in the dim gaslight. It led me through deserted alleyways and darkened streets, its destination unknown. The metallic scent of damp earth clung to its form, a constant reminder of its origins. As we ventured deeper into the city, a profound sense of unease settled within me. The figure's movements became more erratic, as if it sensed my presence. Then it stopped. In the middle of a deserted square, bathed in the eerie glow of a distant street lamp, it turned. Its indistinct head swiveled in my direction, and for a fleeting moment I perceived two pinpoints of light within its amorphous form. A chilling sensation, as if unseen eyes were fixed upon me, pierced the darkness. The figure remained motionless, its gaze unwavering. Then it began to advance. The summons arrived in the form of a frantic note delivered by a breathless footman. A certain Baron Ashworth, a man of considerable wealth and standing, implored my immediate assistance with a matter of the most peculiar and unsettling nature. His conveyance, he claimed, was haunted. Upon my arrival at the Baron's opulent residence, I found him in a state of considerable agitation. His usual composure was shattered, replaced by a palpable anxiety that permeated the very air around him. He recounted his nightly carriage rides, describing a sensation of an unseen entity occupying the seat opposite him. This presence, he insisted, possessed a tangible form, exerting a distinct pressure upon the cushions. My initial inspection of the Baron's carriage revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The plush velvet seats showed no signs of tampering, the springs were sound, and there was no discernible mechanism that could account for the Baron's experience. Yet his distress appeared genuine, and the consistency of his account warranted further investigation. I proposed to accompany the Baron on his nightly ride. He readily agreed, his relief at my willingness to involve myself evident. As dusk descended, we entered the carriage. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern, its flickering flame casting elongated figures on the polished wood panels. The journey commenced. For a time nothing occurred. The rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the gentle sway of the carriage were the only discernible sensations. Then, as we traversed a particularly deserted stretch of road, I perceived it. A subtle depression formed in the velvet of the seat opposite us. It was faint at first, but gradually deepened, as if an unseen form had settled there. I extended my hand towards the indentation. There was no visible presence, yet I could distinctly sense a resistance, a subtle pressure against my palm, as if I were pressing against a yielding but substantial object. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, defying any rational explanation. The Baron, his face pale in the lantern light, nodded grimly. This, he conveyed with a silent gesture, was his nightly tormentor. The pressure on the seat remained constant for the duration of the ride, a silent, invisible companion sharing our journey through the darkness. In the days that followed, I delved into the history of the Baron's carriage. It was an older model, acquired some years prior from a private collector. My inquiries led me to the previous owners, each with a tale to tell, each unknowingly contributing a piece to a disturbing puzzle. The collector from whom the Baron had purchased the carriage had met an untimely demise, falling from a great height under circumstances that remained unexplained. Before him, the carriage had belonged to a renowned actress who had perished in a tragic fire that had inexplicably engulfed her dressing room. And prior to her, a prominent physician had been found lifeless in his study, the cause of death listed as a sudden and inexplicable cardiac arrest. A pattern began to emerge, a chilling correlation between ownership of the carriage and a premature, often inexplicable death. My focus narrowed to the specific seat where the invisible presence manifested. I sought information about anyone who had regularly occupied that particular spot in the carriage throughout its history. The coachman who had served the actress recalled a peculiar incident. A visiting dignitary, a man of considerable stature, had occupied that seat during a short journey. The following day, the dignitary had been discovered in his hotel room, deceased under circumstances that baffled the authorities. The collector had also mentioned a similar occurrence. A business associate, a robust and healthy individual, had ridden in that seat during a brief excursion. Within a week he had succumbed to a sudden and virulent illness. The more I investigated, the more the pattern solidified. Every individual who had regularly or even briefly occupied that specific seat in the Baron's carriage had met with a terrible and often inexplicable fate. The invisible presence was not merely a phantom, it was an omen, a harbinger of death. The Baron, informed of my findings, was understandably distraught. He had been experiencing this phenomenon for several weeks, the unseen occupant a constant reminder of the potential doom that awaited him. He pleaded with me to uncover the source of this spectral visitation, to find a way to rid his carriage and himself of this terrifying presence. I subjected the carriage to further scrutiny, examining every inch of its construction. I employed various scientific instruments, hoping to detect any anomaly, any residual energy or unusual material that might explain the phenomenon, but my efforts yielded nothing. The carriage appeared ordinary, devoid of any discernible supernatural influence, yet the sensation remained. During subsequent rides, the pressure on the opposite seat persisted, a constant, silent reminder of the carriage's grim history. The feeling was becoming more intense, the indentation in the velvet deeper, the resistance against my touch more pronounced. It was as if the unseen entity was growing stronger, its presence becoming more substantial. One evening, as we rode through the darkened streets, the carriage encountered an unexpected jolt, hitting a deep rut in the road. The lantern flickered violently, momentarily plunging the interior into darkness. In that brief instant of blackness, I experienced a sensation unlike any I had encountered before. A coldness, profound and absolute, enveloped me. And for a fleeting moment I perceived a faint, almost imperceptible outline in the seat opposite. A dark, amorphous form that seemed to writhe in the darkness. The lantern flickered back to life and the outline vanished, but the coldness remained, clinging to the air within the carriage. The pressure on the opposite seat intensified, becoming almost unbearable. The Baron gasped, his eyes wide with terror. The carriage continued its journey, the unseen presence, a palpable force between us. The clip-clop of the horse's hooves seemed to echo with a new, more sinister rhythm. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and the feeling of an unseen entity, something ancient and malevolent, filled the carriage. The pressure on the seat opposite continued to mount, and then abruptly it shifted. The indentation in the velvet deepened further, and the pressure no longer felt directed downwards, but rather towards me. The grim tidings reached me via a Scotland Yard runner, his face etched with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. Bodies, several of them, had been recovered from the Thames, each bearing a singular and grotesque similarity. Their skin had been meticulously removed, yet the underlying musculature and skeletal structure remained disturbingly intact. The scene along the riverbank was one of grim fascination for the assembled constables. The lifeless forms lay draped in damp linen, their appearance defying any conventional understanding of violent crime. The police surgeons, their expressions a blend of professional detachment and profound disquiet, could offer no immediate explanation for the bizarre defacement. My own inspection commenced with a careful examination of the bodies. The removal of the skin appeared precise, almost surgical, lacking the ragged edges one might expect from a frenzied attack. There were no other discernible wounds, no signs of struggle or defensive injuries. It was as if the skin had been peeled away with an almost artistic detachment. The river itself flowed past, its murky depths concealing whatever secrets it might hold. The water possessed a certain stillness, a deceptive calm that belied the horror it had yielded. The air carried the damp scent of the river, mingled with a faint metallic tang that prickled the nostrils. My inquiries into the identities of the deceased revealed a disparate group with no obvious connections between them. They hailed from various parts of London, their lives seemingly unconnected. Yet there was a single unsettling thread that began to emerge as I delved deeper into their final days. Several individuals who had known the victims spoke of a shared preoccupation in the days leading up to their disappearance. Each of the deceased had, in separate conversations with friends or family, expressed a growing sense of being observed from the water. They spoke of fleeting glimpses, of a presence just beneath the surface, an awareness of unseen eyes fixed upon them while they were near the Thames. These accounts, initially dismissed as fanciful notions or mere paranoia, now took on a sinister significance in light of their gruesome fate. A pattern was forming, a chilling link between their premonitions and their eventual demise. Something in the Thames had been watching them. I spent considerable time along the riverbanks observing the water at different hours of the day and night. The Thames was a constant presence in London life, a bustling artery of commerce and transport, yet beneath its surface lay a hidden world, a realm of shadows and secrets. During the day, the river teemed with activity barges laden with goods, small boats ferrying passengers, the constant ebb and flow of life. But it was at night, under the cloak of darkness, that the river seemed to possess a different character. The water became a dark, inscrutable expanse, reflecting the faint lights of the city like scattered stars. There were moments, standing alone on the deserted embankment, when I experienced a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a feeling of being observed. The water seemed to possess a sentience, a silent awareness of my presence. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore took on a different quality, almost like a whispered warning. I interviewed individuals who lived and worked along the river. The boatmen, the dock workers, the night watchmen. Many spoke of unusual occurrences, of fleeting shapes glimpsed in the water, of strange currents and eddies that defied explanation. Some recounted old tales and legends, whispers of ancient entities that dwelled within the Thames. One elderly boatman, his face weathered by years spent on the river, spoke of a local superstition, a belief in something ancient and malevolent that resided in the deeper reaches of the Thames, something that occasionally claimed those who spent too much time near its waters. He spoke of a cold dread that would sometimes grip him on moonless nights, a feeling of an unseen presence lurking just beneath the surface. As the days passed, more bodies were recovered, each bearing the same horrifying mutilation. The police investigation floundered, unable to find any logical explanation or identify a potential suspect. The city grew increasingly fearful, the whispers along the Thames growing louder, more frantic. I focused my attention on the specific locations where the victims had reported feeling observed. These were often isolated stretches of the riverbank, dimly lit and frequented by few after nightfall. I spent several nights concealed in these locations, my gaze fixed upon the dark flowing water. The silence of the river at night was profound, broken only by the occasional splash or the distant clang of a ship's bell. The darkness seemed to possess a weight of its own, pressing down on the senses, There were moments when the surface of the water would ripple without any discernible cause, as if something had moved beneath. One night, while observing a particularly secluded stretch of the river near Wapping, I perceived a subtle disturbance in the water. It was not the wake of a boat, nor the natural flow of the current. It was a distinct shape moving just beneath the surface, a long, sinuous form that undulated with an unsettling grace. The shape remained submerged, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It moved with a purpose, following the contours of the riverbank. Then it vanished into the darkness, leaving only a faint ripple on the surface. The feeling of being watched intensified dramatically. It was no longer a vague sensation, it was a palpable awareness of an unseen presence drawing near. The water seemed to hold its breath, the silence growing more profound. Then, from the depths of the river, something began to rise. It was a dark, indistinct form emerging slowly from the murky depths. The water around it rippled and swirled, and a faint phosphorescent glow emanated from below. The shape continued to ascend, its form gradually becoming more defined. The surface of the water broke, and a portion of the emerging entity became visible in the dim light. Its texture appeared slick and strangely smooth. The metallic scent, which had become associated with the discoveries, intensified, carried on the damp night air. The form continued its silent ascent, revealing more of its anatomy. The water around it seemed to darken, as if absorbing the faint light. The shape shifted, and a series of smooth, pale protrusions became visible just beneath the surface, moving with a fluid, unsettling grace towards the riverbank. Lord Ashworth's manor stood amidst sprawling grounds, its imposing facade exuding an air of aged grandeur tinged with a subtle melancholy. He greeted me with a nervous agitation, his usual aristocratic composure frayed at the edges. The matter at hand, he explained, concerned a room on the 3rd floor, a chamber that had remained sealed for generations, yet from within which the distinct sound of footsteps pacing could be discerned every night. The room in question, I learned, had been the scene of a tragic incident decades prior, the details of which were shrouded in local folklore and hushed whispers amongst the servants. Following the unfortunate demise of a former occupant, the door had been sealed, the key lost or destroyed, and the chamber left undisturbed. Yet with an unnerving regularity, the sound of someone traversing the length of the room could be detected after nightfall. No servant dared approach the sealed door, their fear fueled by generations of whispered tales. Upon reaching the 3rd floor, Lord Ashworth indicated a heavy oak door, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust and grime, the wood warped and cracked with age. A substantial iron hasp secured the door, fastened with a rusty padlock. It was evident that the room had remained untouched for a considerable period. The surrounding corridor possessed a stillness that felt almost expectant. Gaining entry required the assistance of a skilled locksmith from the nearby village. The lock, corroded by time, offered little resistance. With a final click, the hasp swung free, revealing the heavy door. A profound silence emanated from within, contrasting sharply with the nightly auditory disturbances described. The door, swollen with age and damp, required considerable effort to open. As it finally yielded, a rush of stale, musty air escaped, carrying with it the scent of decay and forgotten time. The room beyond was plunged in darkness, the only illumination provided by the faint light filtering from the corridor. Lord Ashworth procured a lamp, its flickering flame revealing a chamber frozen in time. Dust lay thick upon every surface, covering antique furniture draped in white sheets. Cobwebs adorned the corners, and the air possessed a stillness that suggested decades of undisturbed slumber. There was no immediate indication of anything amiss, no visible source for the nightly pacing. My initial examination of the room revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The floorboards, though aged, appeared sound. The furniture was intact, albeit covered in dust. The windows were sealed shut, their panes grimy with neglect. There were no secret passages or hidden compartments that I could discern. Then my gaze fell upon the floor. Amidst the thick layer of dust, a series of distinct footprints were visible. They were fresh, their impressions sharp and clear, contrasting starkly with the undisturbed dust that covered the rest of the room. The footprints depicted a path of someone traversing the length of the chamber, back and forth, mirroring the pacing sound described by the household. The chilling aspect of this discovery lay in the fact that these footprints were undeniably recent. The dust surrounding them had not yet settled back into place. Furthermore, the footprints led directly towards the doorway, towards my current position in the room. I examined the footprints closely. They were of a standard size, suggesting an adult male. There were no distinguishing features, no peculiarities in the gait or the impression. They were simply footprints in the dust, yet their presence in a locked room sealed for decades was utterly inexplicable. A thorough search of the room yielded no further clues. The windows remained sealed, the furniture undisturbed. There was no other means of entry or egress. The footprints remained the sole anomaly, a tangible testament to an unseen presence within the locked chamber. The feeling within the room shifted, the initial intrigue giving way to a profound disquiet. The silence now felt heavy, laden with an unspoken question. The fresh footprints in the dust seemed to point directly at me, an unseen path leading from the depths of the sealed room towards the threshold where I stood. The air grew colder, a subtle draught that seemed to emanate from the far corner of the room, the very corner towards which the footprints ultimately led. The stillness in that corner felt different, charged with an unseen energy. The dust motes dancing in the lamplight seemed to swirl with a newfound intensity in that particular area. The footprints, so clear in the dust, now seemed to possess a subtle luminescence in the dim light, their direction towards me somehow more pronounced. The silence of the room was broken by a faint creaking sound, originating from the floorboards directly beneath the footprints, a sound that seemed to echo the nightly pacing. The footprints in the dust appeared to deepen slightly, as if an unseen force was pressing down upon them. The draught from the corner intensified, carrying with it a faint, musty odor, something akin to turned earth. The stillness in the room became absolute. The dust motes hanging suspended in the lamplight, the footprints the only mark in the undisturbed expanse, their direction unwavering. The insistent knocking at the door of 221B Baker Street broke the relative calm of a rain-soaked afternoon. Inspector Gregson stood on the threshold, his usually ruddy complexion somewhat ashen. He spoke of a most peculiar incident reported by a Constable Davies, a reliable officer with an otherwise unblemished record. During a torrential downpour the previous night, Davies swore he had observed me standing motionless in a dimly lit alleyway off Charing Cross Road. The constable described my posture, my attire, even the way my hair was plastered to my forehead by the rain. But it was the officer's final detail that gave the account its truly unsettling character. Davies claimed my eyes were vacant, devoid of any discernible expression, simply staring. The inspector's concern was understandable. My reputation, while often associated with the unconventional, had never extended to spectral appearances in inclement weather while simultaneously being present at my own residence. I assured Gregson that I had remained within these walls throughout the entirety of the previous evening, a fact readily corroborated by Watson, who had been engaged in a game of chess with me until the late hours. However, Gregson's visit proved to be merely the harbinger of a far more disturbing phenomenon. Over the following days, similar reports began to surface from various corners of London. A night watchman near the docks claimed to have observed me standing silently in the gloom, observing the ships. A street vendor in Covent Garden spoke of a fleeting glimpse of my figure disappearing into a darkened doorway. A late-night reveller swore he had passed me on a deserted street in Bloomsbury, my gaze fixed upon him with an unnerving intensity. Each account shared a common thread. The figure bore an undeniable resemblance to myself, was invariably silent, and possessed a fixed, unwavering gaze that instilled a profound sense of disquiet in the observer. The descriptions of attire and mannerisms were consistent with my own, yet there was always a subtle element that hinted at something amiss. I commenced my own investigation into these uncanny appearances. I interviewed each of the individuals who had reported these sightings, meticulously noting every detail of their accounts. The descriptions, while consistent in their broad strokes, contained subtle variations that puzzled me. Some spoke of an almost unnatural stillness, a lack of the subtle twitches and fidgets that are characteristic of my own demeanour. Others mentioned a certain pallor, a lack of vitality in the figure's complexion. I visited each of the locations where the sightings had occurred, attempting to reconstruct the circumstances and discern any logical explanation. Could this be a case of mistaken identity, an elaborate hoax, a concerted effort to impersonate me? The sheer number of independent reports, coupled with the unsettling details, suggested something far more complex. As the days turned into nights, the appearances of my doppelganger became more frequent, more brazen. Reports filtered in from areas closer to Baker Street. A newsboy claimed to have seen me standing motionless outside my own window late one evening. Mrs. Hudson, our ever-vigilant landlady, confessed to having glimpsed a figure resembling me ascending the steps to our lodgings in the dead of night, only to find me already within, engaged in a chemical experiment. The feeling that I was being observed, a sensation I had experienced on occasion during particularly intricate cases, now took on a more personal and unsettling dimension. It was as if I was being watched by myself, scrutinized by my own likeness. One particularly foggy evening, while returning from an engagement, I experienced it firsthand. As I rounded a dimly lit corner in a quiet residential street, I saw him. Standing beneath a gas lamp, his features partially obscured by the swirling mist, was my double. The resemblance was uncanny, almost a perfect mirror image. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed directly upon me. There was no recognition, no hint of emotion in his eyes, just that same vacant, unwavering stare that had so disturbed the constable. A profound sense of the uncanny washed over me. This was not a mere impersonator. There was something fundamentally different about this figure. Its stillness possessed an almost inorganic quality, its gaze devoid of the subtle nuances of human expression. I began to approach the figure, a multitude of questions swirling through my mind. But as I drew nearer, a subtle shift occurred. The air around the figure seemed to ripple, the fog swirling with an unusual intensity, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanished into the swirling mist, as if it had never been there at all. The encounters continued, each one leaving me with a deeper sense of unease. The figure began to appear in places I frequented, as if it were deliberately shadowing me. The distance between us during these encounters continued to diminish. I would sometimes catch a glimpse of it at the periphery of my vision, a fleeting shadow that bore my unmistakable likeness. The thought began to take root in my mind, a chilling suspicion that defied conventional logic. What if this was not a human impersonator? What if this was something else entirely? Something that had assumed my form, something not of this world? The figure's silent, unwavering gaze, its almost preternatural stillness, its ability to seemingly vanish without a trace. These were not the characteristics of mortal man. The final encounter occurred late one night as I was returning to Baker Street. The street was deserted, shrouded in a thick fog. As I neared my door, I saw it standing directly beneath the gas lamp, its face fully illuminated. It was closer than ever before, barely a few feet away. Its eyes, devoid of any light or expression, were fixed upon me with an intensity that transcended mere observation. It remained silent, utterly still. The carriage journey to the isolated manor in Surrey proceeded under a sky devoid of stars. A palpable tension permeated the interior, a reflection of the disquieting tale recounted by the distraught head of the Ainsworth family earlier that day. Their nights, they claimed, were plagued by sounds of unimaginable suffering, vocalizations of pure agony that resonated through the very structure of their home. Upon our arrival, the manor stood silhouetted against the inky sky, its darkened windows like vacant eyes staring into the night. A hushed stillness enveloped the property, a stark contrast to the auditory torment described by the Ainsworths. We were greeted by the patriarch, his face etched with exhaustion and a deep-seated fear. He led us through the silent halls, the only illumination provided by the flickering flame of his handheld lamp. The interior of the manor possessed an aged grandeur, yet a pervasive atmosphere of unease clung to the rooms. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, and the shadows seemed to writhe and deepen in the corners. The Ainsworth family, a wife and two grown children, huddled together in the drawing-room, their faces pale and drawn. They conveyed their nightly ordeal through anxious gestures and whispered explanations, their voices barely above a murmur. As night descended, we positioned ourselves in separate rooms, ensuring a comprehensive observation of the phenomena. Watson occupied a room on the ground floor, while I took up a vantage point in a chamber directly above. The house settled into an absolute silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Then it began, a distant sound, faint at first, but carrying an unmistakable note of anguish. It rose in intensity, becoming a drawn-out vocalization of pure agony, a wail that seemed to claw at the very fabric of the silence. The sound possessed a chilling quality, resonating not just through the air, but through the very bones. The walls seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the sound. The floorboards beneath my feet trembled. The vocalizations continued, a relentless torrent of suffering that echoed through the darkened house. It was a sound that spoke of unimaginable pain, a primal scream ripped from the depths of despair. Hours passed, the agonizing sounds persisting with an unnerving consistency. There was no discernible pattern, no discernible source within the house. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, a disembodied torment that filled every corner of the manor. Then the nature of the sound began to shift. The prolonged wails gradually transformed, the raw agony giving way to something else, something far more unsettling. The vocalizations became fragmented, almost like whispered words carried on the air. I strained my senses, attempting to discern any discernible language within the hushed sounds. At first, it was nothing more than a series of sibilant murmurs, indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves or the sighing of the wind. But gradually, a distinct pattern began to emerge. A sound, barely audible yet undeniably present, began to repeat. It was soft, breathy, almost like a sigh. And then I recognized it, a vocalization of my given name. The sound was faint, distant, yet the distinct articulation sent a shiver down my spine. It was not a shout, not a call, but a whisper, a hushed invocation that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The whispered vocalization of my name repeated, each instance seemingly a fraction more distinct, a fraction nearer. The breathy quality of the sound gave the impression of an unseen presence drawing ever closer. I remained still, my senses on high alert, attempting to pinpoint the origin of the whispered name. It seemed to come from below, from the very room where Watson was stationed, yet there was no indication that he was the source. The whispering continued, the sound growing in intensity, the proximity increasing with each repetition. It was no longer a distant murmur. It was a breathy invocation just outside my chamber door. I moved silently to the door, my hand resting on the cold metal of the handle. The whispering persisted on the other side, my name uttered with a chilling intimacy, as if the unseen source was mere inches away. The vocalization of my name came again, closer still, seemingly emanating from within the room itself. The breathy quality of the sound was now almost tangible, as if a spectral presence was standing just behind me. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping across the darkened chamber. The only illumination came from the faint moonlight filtering through the window, casting long, distorted shapes on the floor. There was nothing there, yet the whispering persisted, my name uttered in a hushed tone that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. The sound was now so close, so intimate, that it felt as if the unseen source was breathing directly into my ear. The vocalization came once more, a mere breath away, and then silence. A profound absolute silence descended upon the manor, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. The stillness remained heavy and expectant. The woman who stood nervously twisting her apron in the doorway of 221 B. Baker Street presented a picture of genuine distress. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a mere whisper, conveying a tale of a lodger in her establishment who had become a source of profound disquiet. This tenant, a Mr. Silas Croft, had occupied his room for several weeks, paying his rent punctually in advance, yet he had never once left the confines of his chamber. He had never spoken a single word, nor had he ever requested food or drink. Initially, the landlady, a Mrs. Miggins, had attributed this peculiar behavior to extreme reclusiveness. However, as the days stretched into weeks without any sign of life from within the room, her concern had escalated into a palpable fear. Finally, driven by a sense of dread, she had dared to peek through the keyhole. What she had glimpsed within had terrified her beyond measure. A dark figure, seated perfectly still in the corner, its form indistinct in the gloom. Accompanied by Watson, I made my way to Mrs. Miggins' lodging house, a somewhat dilapidated building in a less salubrious part of the city. The atmosphere within the house was heavy with an unspoken apprehension. Mrs. Miggins led us to the room in question, a small, sparsely furnished chamber on the second floor. The door was closed, and a faint, musty odour emanated from beneath it. Mrs. Miggins produced a spare key, her hand trembling as she inserted it into the lock. With a soft click, the door swung inward, revealing a room shrouded in a dim, stagnant gloom. The curtains were drawn, allowing only slivers of daylight to penetrate the interior. The air within felt cold, despite the mildness of the afternoon. My initial survey of the room confirmed Mrs. Miggins's description. A figure sat in the far corner, its form indistinct in the semi-darkness. It was completely still, its posture suggesting a seated position, though the details of its shape remained elusive. The silence within the room was absolute, broken only by the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet. I advanced into the room, my senses on high alert. As I drew nearer to the seated figure, a peculiar sensation began to manifest itself. A subtle chill permeated the air around it, a coldness that seemed to emanate directly from its form. The stillness of the figure remained absolute, devoid of any sign of respiration or life. Reaching the corner, I extended my hand to touch the seated form. My fingers met empty air. There was nothing there. The corner was vacant, the shadows playing tricks on the eye. Yet as my gaze swept across the dusty floor, I noticed a distinct impression in the thick layer of grime. In the corner where Mrs. Miggins had described the dark figure sitting, there was a clear imprint in the dust, the unmistakable outline of someone having been seated there for a considerable period. The dust around the imprint was undisturbed, indicating that whatever had occupied that spot had vanished without leaving any further trace. The imprint was deep, as if a substantial had rested there. The shape was roughly humanoid, though slightly elongated and indistinct in its finer details. The dust within the imprint was compressed, suggesting a significant and sustained application of pressure. I examined the rest of the room meticulously. The bed was untouched, the covers neatly folded. There was no sign of any food or drink having been brought into the room. The window was sealed shut from the inside, the latch firmly fastened. The door had been locked from the outside, as Mrs. Miggins had confirmed. There was no other means of entry or egress. The imprint in the dust remained the sole evidence of the room's mysterious occupant. It was fresh, clearly defined, as if someone had just risen from the spot moments before our arrival. The air in that corner remained noticeably colder than the rest of the room. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, something akin to dry earth, seemed to emanate from the disturbed dust within the imprint. The stillness in that corner possessed a different quality, a charged silence that felt expectant. The dust motes dancing in the faint light seemed to avoid that particular area, creating a small, localized void in the otherwise dusty atmosphere. The imprint in the dust appeared slightly deeper, as if an unseen force was still pressing down upon it. The coldness intensified, spreading outwards from the corner, a subtle yet pervasive chill that enveloped the entire room. The silence deepened, becoming almost absolute, the only sound the faint thumping of my own pulse. Lord Harrington's distress was evident in the tremor in his voice as he recounted the bizarre and terrifying events plaguing his ancestral home. For generations, a tale had been whispered within the family, a chilling legend of a shadowy figure that materialized on the grand staircase at precisely 17 minutes past 2 every morning. This apparition, it was claimed, remained perfectly still and silent, yet anyone unfortunate enough to witness it would succumb to an inexplicable demise within the following 7 days. Scoffing at what I initially perceived as superstitious nonsense, amplified by familial anxiety, I nonetheless agreed to investigate. The opportunity to dissect such an outlandish claim held a certain intellectual appeal. Accompanied by Watson, I journeyed to Harrington Hall, a sprawling estate steeped in history and an undeniable atmosphere of unease. The family, a collection of pale and anxious individuals, spoke of the phenomenon with a mixture of fear and resignation. Several recent inexplicable deaths within the household had lent a grim credence to the ancient legend. The grand staircase, a sweeping structure of dark oak that dominated the main hall, was the focal point of their terror. No servant dared venture near it after midnight, and the family themselves avoided the ground floor entirely during the early hours of the morning. I established myself in a concealed alcove overlooking the staircase, equipped with a timepiece and a discreet source of illumination. Watson, though skeptical, remained in an adjacent room, ready to assist if needed. The house settled into an unnerving silence as the hours ticked by. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, its resonant tones echoing through the deserted mansion. The minutes crawled by with glacial indifference. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. My gaze remained fixed on the foot of the grand staircase, the darkness concealing whatever might lie in wait. Then, as the hands of my pocket watch approached the appointed hour, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. A distinct chill permeated the air, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the staircase itself. The shadows in the hall appeared to deepen, becoming more defined, almost as if they possessed a substance of their own. Precisely as the minute hand reached the 17 mark past the second hour, a form began to coalesce on the grand staircase. It was indistinct at first, a mere absence of light against the surrounding gloom. But gradually it solidified, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It stood motionless on the third step from the bottom, its form shrouded in an impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb the faint light filtering from the upper landing. The figure remained perfectly still, its posture erect, its form devoid of any discernible features. It did not move, did not speak, did not betray any sign of animation, yet its presence was undeniable. A silent, shadowy sentinel standing sentinel in the dead of night. A profound sense of disquiet settled over me, a feeling that transcended mere intellectual curiosity. There was something profoundly unsettling about this silent, motionless apparition. It exuded an aura of coldness, a sense of an ancient and malevolent presence. I observed the figure for what felt like an eternity. It remained steadfastly still, its dark form a stark contrast against the aged oak of the staircase. There was no discernible source of its manifestation, no logical explanation for its sudden appearance at the precise stroke of 2:17 a.m. Then a subtle shift occurred. The shadowy figure, still motionless, seemed to turn. Its lack of discernible features made it impossible to ascertain with certainty. Yet the sense was unmistakable. It was now facing my concealed alcove, its unseen gaze directed precisely at my position. A cold dread washed over me, a primal instinct screaming of danger. The silence in the hall seemed to intensify, becoming almost deafening. The shadowy figure remained there, its unseen eyes fixed upon me, its stillness somehow more menacing than any overt action. The minutes continued to tick by, each one an agonizing eternity. The figure remained on the staircase, its attention seemingly focused solely on my hidden vantage point. There was a sense of anticipation in its stillness, as if it were expecting something. Then a faint sound, almost imperceptible, reached my ears. It was a soft scraping emanating from the staircase itself, just below the shadowy figure. The sound was singular, easily missed, yet in the context of the preceding events it carried a chilling connotation. The scraping sound recurred, this time a fraction more distinct. It seemed to be coming from the step directly beneath the figure's unseen feet. The sound was faint yet persistent, almost like something was attempting to gain purchase on the aged wood. The scraping continued, the sound now seemingly directly below the shadowy form. A subtle undulation appeared in the darkness that comprised the figure, a faint ripple as if something was stirring within its shadowy depths. The unseen gaze remained fixed upon me. The scraping sound ceased. The shadowy figure remained motionless, its attention unwavering. Then a single step creaked on the staircase, the sound echoing through the silent hall. The shadowy figure remained on the third step, yet the creak had originated from the fourth, directly below. The innkeeper's account was riddled with a genuine terror that transcended mere pecuniary concern for his missing patrons. Several guests, occupying rooms on the upper floors, had vanished overnight, their chambers locked from the inside, their possessions untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of struggle, just an inexplicable absence where a paying guest had been the night before. Under the guise of a Meister Silas Harrington, a reclusive scholar seeking quiet lodgings, I secured a room on the third floor of the establishment. The room was small and sparsely furnished, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a solitary chair. The window looked out onto the dimly lit thoroughfare of Drury Lane, the sounds of the city a muted murmur several stories below. My initial inspection of the room revealed nothing unusual. The single door possessed a sturdy lock and bolt, both of which functioned without impediment. The window, though old, closed securely. There were no secret passages or hidden compartments that I could discern. The stillness within the room possessed a certain finality, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. As night deepened, the sounds from the street below gradually subsided, replaced by an almost absolute quiet within the inn. I extinguished the lamp, allowing my senses to adjust to the darkness. The room became an inky blackness, the faint glow from the streetlights below offering little illumination. For a time there was nothing but silence and the feeling of solitude. Then a subtle disturbance registered in my awareness, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, emanating from the far corner of the room. It was not a distinct noise, but rather a subtle shift in the stillness, a minute disruption of the absolute quiet. I remained motionless, my senses acutely attuned to any further anomaly. The faint sound recurred, a soft rustling like dry leaves being disturbed by a gentle breeze. Yet there was no breeze within the sealed room. The sound seemed to originate near the wardrobe, a tall, imposing piece of furniture that stood against the wall opposite the bed. The rustling sound persisted, becoming slightly more distinct. It was accompanied by a faint creaking, as if the wooden floorboards were being subjected to a minute application of pressure. The sounds were intermittent, yet their recurrence suggested a source beyond mere chance or the settling of the old building. A distinct sensation began to develop, a feeling that I was no longer alone in the room. It was not a visual perception, but rather an intuitive awareness of another presence, something unseen sharing the confined space. The subtle sounds continued, and with each recurrence the feeling of proximity intensified. The rustling sound shifted, now seeming to emanate from the side of the room near the window. It was accompanied by a soft scraping, as if something was dragging lightly across the wooden floor. The sound was faint, yet its direction of travel was discernible. It was moving. The scraping sound continued, its trajectory bringing it gradually closer to the bed. The feeling of the unseen presence intensified, becoming almost tangible. I remained still, feigning sleep, my senses on high alert. The scraping sound ceased, the room fell silent once more, but the silence now possessed a different quality, a charged stillness that spoke of a presence held in abeyance. I could sense it, an unseen entity somewhere within the confines of the small room. Then a new sound registered. A soft, almost inaudible dragging sound, this time originating from the foot of the bed. It was a slow, deliberate sound, conveying a sense of inexorable approach. The feeling of the unseen presence drew nearer, its proximity becoming increasingly unnerving. The dragging sound continued, its source now seemingly alongside the bed. I could sense a subtle shift in the air, a faint coolness that brushed against my skin. The unseen presence was mere inches away. The dragging sound stopped once more. The silence returned, heavier now, laden with an anticipation that sent a chill through me. Then a faint pressure registered on the edge of the bed, a subtle depression in the mattress beside me, as if an unseen form had just settled there. The feeling of an icy breath brushed against my cheek. The report reached me via Inspector Baines, his usual air of professional detachment tinged with a palpable bewilderment. A Mr. Alistair Finch, a reclusive artist of some local renown, had been discovered deceased within his locked studio. The circumstances surrounding his demise were unremarkable, a suspected heart seizure. However, it was the nature of his final artistic endeavour that had piqued the inspector's curiosity, and indeed my own. Upon our arrival at the address in Chelsea, a detached mews house, we were met by the sombre figure of the family solicitor. He confirmed the details relayed by Inspector Baines, emphasizing the solitary nature of the deceased's life. The studio, located on the upper floor, had been locked from the inside, the key found clutched in the artist's hand. The room itself possessed the characteristic disorder of a working artist. Canvases stacked against the walls, brushes scattered across tables, the air thick with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil. The deceased lay sprawled before an easel, his features frozen in an expression of what might have been surprise or perhaps terror. It was the canvas on the easel that commanded my immediate attention. It was unfinished, the background a mere wash of muted colours, yet the central figure was rendered with a startling clarity. It depicted a man standing within a room. A room instantly recognizable as this very studio. The man in the painting was myself. The likeness was undeniable, capturing not only my physical appearance, but also a certain characteristic posture, a slight inclination of the head I often adopt when in deep thought. The figure in the painting was positioned near the doorway, the very spot where I now stood, and its gaze was directed outwards, meeting the viewer's eyes with an unnerving intensity. The shock of this discovery was considerable. I had never encountered a Mr. Alistair Finch. I had no knowledge of his existence until this very moment. Furthermore, I had never set foot inside this studio before today. The notion that an artist unknown to me could depict me with such accuracy in a setting I had never visited defied any logical explanation. My examination of the studio commenced with a renewed intensity. I scrutinized the painting, searching for any clue, any indication of how this could be possible. The style was competent, the brushstrokes confident, yet there was an unsettling quality to the depiction, an almost spectral stillness in the figure's eyes. I questioned the solicitor at length regarding Mr. Finch's life, his acquaintances, his habits. He painted a picture of a solitary individual, a man consumed by his art, with few visitors and no known connections to anyone bearing my description. The other members of the household, distant relatives who had discovered the body, corroborated this account. The remainder of the day was spent meticulously examining the studio. I searched for sketches, notes, anything that might shed light on this bizarre artistic premonition. Amongst the clutter, I discovered numerous studies of faces, landscapes, still life arrangements, but nothing that offered any explanation for my sudden appearance in the artist's final work. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie forms within the studio, a distinct feeling began to creep over me. It was a sensation of being observed, a prickling awareness that transcended the mere knowledge of the painted figure's gaze. It was as if something within the room itself was scrutinizing me. I remained in the studio long after Inspector Baines and the solicitor had departed, the single lamp casting a feeble circle of light in the growing darkness. The silence of the room became profound, amplifying the slightest sound. The painted figure on the easel seemed to watch me from the shadows, its gaze unwavering. There were moments when the arrangement of the objects within the studio seemed to shift subtly. A book moved fractionally on a shelf, a brush rolled imperceptibly across a table. These minute alterations were easily dismissed as tricks of the light or the product of an overactive imagination, yet they contributed to a growing sense of disquiet. The painting continued to exert a strange fascination. I found myself drawn back to it repeatedly, studying the depicted version of myself, searching for some hidden meaning in its brushstrokes, some subtle clue in its composition. The eyes in the painting seemed to possess a life of their own, their gaze following me as I moved about the room. As the night deepened, the feeling of being observed intensified. It was no longer confined to the vicinity of the painting, it permeated the entire studio. It was as if unseen eyes were fixed upon me from every corner, scrutinizing my every action. The silence of the studio was broken by a faint creaking sound emanating from somewhere within the walls. It was a singular sound, easily dismissed as the settling of the old house. Yet, in the context of the preceding events, it carried a more sinister connotation. The creaking sound recurred, this time a fraction nearer. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind the easel, the very wall against which the unfinished painting rested. The sound was faint yet persistent, almost like something was moving within the fabric of the building itself. The creaking continued, the sound now seemingly directly behind the canvas. A faint scratching sound accompanied it, as if something was attempting to penetrate the wall. The feeling of an unseen presence intensified, drawing impossibly near. The scratching grew more insistent and then abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with an unspoken anticipation. The painted figure on the easel remained, its gaze fixed, its expression unchanged. The asylum nurse arrived at Baker Street in a state of considerable distress, her hands trembling as she recounted the horrifying events unfolding within the institution where she served. A particular wing, designated for patients with acute anxieties, had become the site of a series of inexplicable deaths. One by one, the afflicted individuals were being discovered lifeless in their beds, their faces contorted in expressions of unimaginable terror. Each of them, the nurse claimed, had spoken of indistinct vocalizations just prior to their demise, hushed whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Intrigued by the macabre nature of the case, and the apparent lack of any discernible physical cause for the fatalities, I accompanied the nurse to the asylum. The building itself possessed an air of profound melancholy, its long corridors echoing with an unsettling silence punctuated by the occasional muffled cry or lament. The affected wing was segregated from the rest, its entrance marked by a palpable shift in atmosphere, a chilling stillness that seemed to cling to the very plasterwork. The rooms within the wing were sparsely furnished, each containing a narrow bed and little else. The air possessed a stagnant quality, a faint medicinal scent mingling with something else, something indefinable, yet distinctly unpleasant. I examined the rooms where the deaths had occurred, noting the meticulous order of the belongings, the absence of any signs of struggle. The deceased patients, though no longer present, had left behind an intangible residue of fear, a psychic imprint that seemed to permeate the very fabric of the place. I interviewed the other nurses and attendants who had been on duty during the incidents. Their accounts corroborated the initial report. The patients in their final days had become increasingly agitated, complaining of faint vocalizations that no one else could discern. They would clutch their heads, their eyes wide with a terror that seemed to stem from some unseen, unheard source. As I spent more time within the affected wing, a subtle sensation began to manifest itself. A faint auditory perception, almost at the threshold of awareness, a hushed murmur that seemed to emanate from the periphery of my hearing. It was indistinct, unintelligible, yet undeniably present. I initially attributed it to the ambient sounds of the old building, the creaking of pipes or the rustling of air currents. However, as the hours passed, the faint auditory perception persisted, becoming slightly more pronounced. It was a constant undercurrent to the silence, a sibilant susurrus that seemed to weave its way into the very stillness of the wing. I focused my attention, attempting to isolate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a pervasive whisper that enveloped the entire area. The longer I remained within the wing, the more distinct the whispering became. Individual sounds began to coalesce, forming patterns that hinted at language, though the words themselves remained elusive. The vocalizations seemed to fluctuate in intensity, sometimes fading into near silence, only to return with a renewed, almost insistent quality. I moved from room to room, attempting to pinpoint the origin of the whispers. In some areas they seemed fainter, in others more pronounced, yet they were always there, a constant auditory backdrop to my investigation. The feeling of being surrounded by unseen voices grew stronger, creating a sense of profound isolation, even in the presence of others. As night descended upon the asylum, casting long, distorted shapes along the corridors, the whispering intensified further. The hushed murmurs began to take on a more defined character, individual vocalizations becoming almost discernible. It was as if the unseen speakers were drawing nearer, their voices growing in volume and clarity. I found myself straining to decipher the unintelligible words, my mind attempting to impose order on the chaotic susurrus. The whispers seemed to swirl around me, a cacophony of hushed voices just beyond the grasp of comprehension. The feeling of being the focus of this unseen chorus grew stronger, an unsettling sensation of being scrutinized by unseen entities. The vocalizations continued to escalate, the individual whispers becoming more distinct, more insistent. It was no longer a faint murmur, it was a chorus of hushed voices just at the edge of my hearing, their unintelligible words seeming to press in on all sides. The very air seemed to vibrate with their silent pronouncements. The whispering intensified, becoming almost deafening in its pervasive presence, a constant sibilant drone that filled every corner of the wing. The vocalizations grew even more pronounced, individual whispers now almost understandable, their source seemingly just beyond the periphery of my vision. The hushed voices continued their relentless ascent in volume, the unintelligible words now possessing a distinct, chilling quality, as if they were being spoken directly into my mind. The whispering intensified yet again, the vocalizations now a torrent of hushed pronouncements, their source seeming to be everywhere and nowhere, pressing in from all sides. The whispers continued their relentless climb in intensity, the individual vocalizations now almost clear, their meaning just beyond my grasp, yet their tone undeniably personal. The hushed voices swelled, becoming an overwhelming auditory assault, their unintelligible words now resonating with a chilling familiarity. The whispering reached a fever pitch, the vocalizations now a deafening chorus, their source seemingly within the very confines of my own skull. The fog swirled through the London streets, a familiar grey shroud that often accompanied my late-night wanderings. It was on one such occasion, while traversing a dimly lit alleyway off Fleet Street, that I experienced a jolt of profound disbelief. Emerging from the swirling mist was a figure I recognized with absolute certainty, a man named Silas Blackwood, whom I had personally witnessed being hanged at Newgate Prison barely 6 months prior for the brutal murder of a pawnbroker. The shock was visceral. My mind, usually a bastion of logic and reason, struggled to reconcile the image before me with the undeniable reality of Blackwood's execution. The man standing across the alleyway, his features gaunt in the gaslight, was undeniably him. The same angular jawline, the same distinctive set to his eyes. He simply stood there amidst the swirling fog, his gaze fixed directly upon me. There was no recognition in his expression, no hint of malice, just a silent, unwavering stare that sent a chill down my spine. My initial reaction was to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a fleeting resemblance conjured by the fog and the late hour. Yet as I composed myself and focused my gaze, the figure remained, its presence solid and undeniable. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the figure turned and receded back into the fog, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. The following morning, despite my rational inclinations, I initiated an inquiry into the matter. I contacted my sources within Scotland Yard, requesting confirmation of Silas Blackwood's execution and subsequent burial. The official records were unequivocal. Blackwood had been pronounced dead, and his body had been interred in the paupers section of a local cemetery. Further inquiries with the prison chaplain and the undertaker confirmed the details. There was no doubt. Silas Blackwood was deceased and buried. Despite this irrefutable evidence, a seed of disquiet had been planted. Several days later, while observing the comings and goings at a busy railway terminus, I saw him again, standing amidst the bustling crowd. His figure, somehow isolated and still, was Silas Blackwood. His gaze, as before, was fixed directly upon me, a silent, unwavering stare that seemed to penetrate my very being. This time he was at a greater distance, yet the recognition was unmistakable. Before I could react, before I could move towards him, he turned and vanished into the throng of commuters. The encounters continued, each one more unsettling than the last. I would catch glimpses of him in various locations across the city, a fleeting figure in a crowded marketplace, a solitary form standing beneath a gas lamp in a deserted street. Each time his gaze was the same, direct, silent, and fixed upon me. There was never any attempt at communication, no expression of recognition or threat, just that unnerving, unwavering stare. With each sighting, the distance between us seemed to diminish. The encounters became less fleeting, the figure remaining in my sight for longer durations. During one particularly foggy evening near the embankment, he stood across the street from me for what felt like an age, his form clearly illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby public house. The silence between us felt charged, pregnant with an unspoken dread. I began to actively seek him out, spending hours traversing the city, my senses constantly alert for any sign of the spectral figure. It was during one such search in the labyrinthine alleyways of Whitechapel that I encountered him at a disturbingly close proximity. He stood at the end of a narrow passage, barely 10 feet away, his features stark in the gloom. For the first time I noticed a subtle detail I had previously missed. His eyes, though fixed upon me, possessed a peculiar stillness, a lack of the subtle micro-movements that characterize living eyes. The realization sent a fresh wave of chill through me. This was not merely a man resembling Silas Blackwood. This was something else, something that defied the natural order. He remained there, his gaze unwavering, and then with a fluid, almost ethereal motion, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the alleyway. The encounters grew more frequent, the figure appearing in increasingly familiar locations. I would sometimes sense his presence, even before I saw him, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a prickling sensation on my skin. The distance between us continued to shrink. I encountered him outside my own lodgings on Baker Street one evening, standing across the road, his silent vigil somehow more menacing in its proximity to my sanctuary. The most recent encounter occurred just last night. I was returning from an engagement, walking along a quiet residential street in Marylebone. The street was deserted, the only sound the echo of my own footsteps. Then I saw him. He stood directly in my path, barely a few feet away. The gaslight illuminated his gaunt features, his fixed gaze boring into me with an intensity that was almost unbearable. He remained silent, his eyes devoid of any flicker of life. The stillness of his gaze was absolute. The train journey into Dorset progressed under a sky the colour of slate. Upon our arrival at the village, a peculiar stillness hung in the atmosphere, a silence broken only by the distant caw of a crow. The air possessed a dampness that clung to everything, and an unusual gloom permeated the surroundings, even beyond what one might expect from an overcast day. The village itself appeared quaint, with its thatched cottages and winding lanes, yet an undercurrent of apprehension was evident in the faces of the few inhabitants we encountered. They spoke of the fog in hushed tones, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed deeply ingrained. This was no ordinary mist, they insisted. This was something else, something darker. The fog, when it appeared, was unlike any I had ever witnessed. It was not the familiar grey of London, but a dense, black mass that seemed to absorb all light. It rolled in with an unnerving swiftness, a silent tide engulfing the landscape. The villagers claimed it had a predilection for certain individuals, appearing just before they vanished, leaving no trace behind. My initial inquiries yielded little in the way of concrete evidence. The disappearances were baffling. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, just an individual present one moment and gone the next. The black fog, the only precursor. The local constabulary were at a loss, their investigations having reached a dead end. As I began my own examination, I found myself drawn to the places where the disappearances had occurred. Standing in the now empty homes, a profound sense of emptiness pervaded the atmosphere. There was an absence that extended beyond the physical, a void that seemed to resonate with an unsettling energy. One evening as I walked through the village, the black fog descended with an almost sentient purpose. It swirled around me, thick and suffocating, reducing visibility to mere feet. The silence within its embrace was absolute, amplifying the sound of my own breathing. Then it happened. A fleeting image flashed before my eyes, unbidden and utterly disturbing. I glimpsed a distorted face within the swirling darkness, its features contorted in an expression of silent agony. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with a profound sense of disquiet. I initially dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of fatigue and an overactive imagination. Yet, as the days passed, the visions persisted. They were brief, fragmented glimpses into something terrifying, something just beyond the reach of my conscious understanding. I would see fleeting figures within the fog, their forms shifting and indistinct, their silent screams echoing in the recesses of my mind. The feeling of being observed intensified. It was a constant awareness, a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were constantly fixed upon me from within the swirling blackness. I would often turn suddenly, convinced that I would finally perceive the source of this unsettling sensation. But there was never anything there, only the impenetrable fog. I spent hours studying the patterns of the fog, its seemingly erratic appearances and disappearances. There was a strange intelligence to its behavior, an almost predatory quality that sent a chill down my spine. It seemed to possess an awareness of its intended victims, appearing only when they were alone, vulnerable. My sleep became troubled, filled with fragmented nightmares that mirrored the disturbing visions I experienced during the day. I would wake in a cold sweat, the lingering feeling of unseen eyes upon me refusing to dissipate. The village, once quaint and peaceful, now felt like a place shrouded in an ancient dread. One afternoon, while examining the site of the most recent disappearance, the black fog descended with an unusual intensity. It felt different this time, more oppressive, more focused. The air grew cold, and a faint metallic scent permeated the fog, a scent that triggered an instinctive sense of alarm within me. The visions became more frequent, more vivid. I glimpsed fleeting images of the missing villagers, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes wide with a silent terror. They seemed trapped within the swirling darkness, reaching out with unseen hands. The feeling of being watched reached a fever pitch. It was no longer a subtle sensation, it was an overwhelming awareness of an unseen presence drawing near. I could almost feel its gaze upon me, cold and intent, as if something within the fog was singling me out. I found myself drawn to the edge of the village, where the fog seemed to originate. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something significant was about to occur. The blackness here was absolute, impenetrable. Then from the depths of the fog, a form began to materialize. It was indistinct at first, a dark shape emerging from the swirling blackness. As it solidified, I could discern a figure, its outline vaguely human, yet somehow wrong. It stood motionless, its form partially obscured by the fog, but its presence was undeniable. A profound sense of dread washed over me, colder and more absolute than anything I had ever experienced. The figure remained silent, unmoving, yet its very stillness radiated an aura of unimaginable menace. I could feel its gaze upon me, an intense, unseen focus that pierced through the fog and into my very core. The shape began to drift forward soundlessly, and the metallic scent in the air intensified.